jump in to this Lenten series, 24 Hours That Changed the World. This is week 3 of Lent. Lent is a season of preparation for Easter. And so it's appropriate if the sermons are a little more somber, if they're a little more challenging, frankly. Lent is a time for a gut check, to kind of examine our souls a little bit. And we always want to do that throughout the year, but Lent even more so. And so, as Americans, we're kind of like razzle-dazzle, hardy-har-har. We always want to have a good time. We live in an entertainment culture, don't we? And at the same time, we realize, man, there's a lot of things we miss in our kind of American way of life. We don't grieve very well. You know what I mean? Like we lose something and we're expected to get over it. We don't do the inner life very well in our culture. And Lent is a time, especially in our culture, for us to kind of turn inward and ask some questions of ourselves. And that's what we're doing in this series. And so I'm going to throw out some questions today that are challenging to me personally, extremely challenging to me personally. And they might be to you as well, as we find ourselves in the story of Jesus in the last 24 hours of his life on earth through his crucifixion. We're going to look at the details of his life and their historical context. You might hear some things you haven't heard before. There might be some aha moments. If you're just kind of a Bible geek and you love learning, about Scripture in a new way, you're going to hear some of that stuff. But not only that, some of those details will help you to see the story in a new way and be able to find meaning in it and surprising connections to your own life as well. And so the major movements of the last 24 hours of Jesus' life is he shared a Last Supper with his disciples, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. And then last week, Aaron gave an absolutely outstanding sermon on the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus' experience there. And today, we're talking about his trial. And the title of the sermon is Condemned by the Righteous. Jesus was condemned by people who saw themselves as righteous religious people. In Christian theology, Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh, right? And then there were people who believed they spoke for God. They were God's representatives. And so the people who saw themselves as God's representatives, the representatives of religion, the religious authorities, killed God. And that's ironic, isn't it? And we see that irony play out throughout religious history. And even in our own time. We talked about that in the last series, spiritual but not religious. And so that's what happens in this trial of Jesus. So we're going to start by reading a rather long scripture passage. It'll take a couple of minutes to read the passage, but I just kind of want to read it and just soak it in and understand what's going on. Then we'll break that down a little bit. We're going to look at 3 fears that the people in this passage encounter, and then we're going to be able to find ourselves in this story and ask ourselves, do I struggle with these fears? And if so, how so? And what can I do about it? So let's dive in. Mark chapter 14, it'll be on the screen. Mark 14, verses 53 through 72, and this is when I pop a cough drop. Let's read together. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter, who was Simon Peter, like the lead disciple in Jesus' followers, Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, we'll talk about what that means, were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple. He's talking about the temple in Jerusalem, made with human hands, and in 3 days we'll build another, not made with hands. Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes, a sign of anger and outrage. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy, and the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself there at the fire, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. That's where Jesus is from, northern Israel. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him before the rooster crows twice. You will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. The old translation says he wept bitterly. Have you ever wept bitterly? That's what happened to him. Well, the earliest followers of Jesus, let's just start with the obvious, believed that Jesus was executed unjustly, that he didn't deserve to die. Lots of people were executed unjustly in the Roman Empire, and the same, I would argue, is true today. So there's a question historically that Bible scholars wrestle with. Would the Sanhedrin have tried Jesus in this way? One of my best friends is a rabbi. And so when you read passages like this, it brings up some of the old conflicts between Christians and Jews. You see what I'm saying? The Sanhedrin was the Jewish ruling council. And Jesus was a Jew, and Peter was a Jew, and all of his followers were Jews. And so this is an intra-family argument happening here about what it means to be the Jewish Messiah, kind of a superhero who would be a divine warrior who would be empowered by God to lead the people to freedom. That's what the Messiah, Mashiach, means. And so this is an argument about what that means and who this person is. And is Jesus that person or not? So we have to be very, very careful when we talk about these subjects because we live post-Holocaust, and we've seen what happens when anti-Semitism creeps in to Christian cultures, predominantly. And so we want to be very careful. The Great Sanhedrin met in Jerusalem, and they functioned as kind of a combination of our Senate and Supreme Court. They had a lot of power. There were 70 ruling elders plus the high priest for a total of 71. They usually met in the temple courts, but it was permissible for them to meet in the palace of the high priest if they had an emergency meeting. It would have been highly unusual to meet at night like this. There are historians that question whether this happened or not. Okay, this is a church where we say questions and doubts welcome. We don't know the answer to that. We weren't there. You haven't seen the videos, neither have I. But we're reading the passage and we're doing our best to honestly deal with it. So that's the setup. But Jesus is asked this question by the high priest. And Jesus' answer is interpreted as blasphemy. He's made himself equal with God and God's Messiah. And so that's enough to dispatch of him theologically. That's what we're reading in the passage. He's probably lowered into a pit for several hours throughout the night. If the holy sites in Israel are the real ones, I've been in this pit when I visited there in 2012, and I have some guests from our sponsoring church, the church in Aurora back in Ohio, who were there as well. Welcome, guys. And it would not be a pleasant place to be. And so this is a torturous place, dark, water, just awful. And then he was taken to Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor who oversaw the area because the Romans had conquered this land that is now Israel. We'll talk about that next week. And then Jesus was tried. The Jews didn't have the power to kill anybody. So the Jewish people did not crucify Jesus. The Jews didn't crucify, and they didn't have the power to kill anybody. That was a Roman thing. It was a Roman execution, which is crucifixion, and a Roman decision. It's extremely important that we say that. We'll talk about that more next week, as I said. So we have this continual irony throughout history that people who claim to represent God, religious people, often act against God's purposes. In the last series, we said that's the central plot of Jesus' life. And we see that today, don't we? Many of you here, you look at religion, you look at, whether it's the televangelist on TV smacking people on the forehead, or whether it's kind of the moral police of society, they're condemning certain people and blaming certain people for all kinds of problems in society, or people who have hurt you directly in your religious experience, or really, really awkward Thanksgiving dinners that you have every single year. When you try to talk with your family about religion and politics, which how does that always work out, right? And so you felt the pain of this probably, this continual irony. And as Jesus said, he said to these people, you killed the prophets. God sends prophets to you and people to kind of show you the right way and who God really is and what's good and what's beautiful and what's true in the world, and they end up dead. Because often God's ways bump up against the established religious institutions and culture, the power systems in culture, and people who represent God often get killed. Martin Luther King was shot to death. We could go through so many examples of how this happens, time after time again. Oscar Wilde said, if you tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they'll kill you. Words of wisdom, right? We just see this happen over and over and over again. So, in all of this story and this trial, we see three examples of people denying Jesus, distancing themselves from Jesus, distancing themselves from goodness, love, beauty, truth, the right thing, and instead acting violently, hurting other people, protecting their own interests, and not caring about the interests of others. And the motivating factor in all three of those things is fear. We see fear in at least three different ways in this story. And so today we're going to talk about fear. And there's a lot of fear in our culture right now, isn't there? And we all have our own fears. If I were to ask you right now, what do you fear? And you were honest, and if I could share the same thing, what do you fear? We could have a long talk about that, couldn't we? About our fears. And Aaron showed a clip a few weeks ago of Rob Bell, who said, the more you feed fear, the hungrier it gets. And we could talk about how we feel that cycle of fear in our own lives. But here's some things that we can look at and find ourselves in this story. Number one, you'll be feared and hurt when you don't follow the rules. You will be feared and you will likely be hurt in some way when you don't follow the rules. What do I mean by that? Jesus didn't follow the rules. He had a different interpretation of the Bible than what was common in his culture. Much of the conflict Jesus faced with the religious authorities and with his family members and with his friends and in his own life happened because he had a different interpretation of the Bible than they did. Can anybody identify with that at all here in One Church? Right? That was funnier in my head than it was out loud. That's fine. I apologize. Sense the sarcasm, right? So he had a different interpretation. He had a different view of religion and politics and things he thought were important than a lot of the people around him. He challenged common practices. He healed on the Sabbath. He did things he wasn't supposed to do in that culture. And once again, it bumped up against people who felt like they were the established rule keepers. They were the authority, the gatekeepers. And he put himself in conflict with those people because he did what he believed was right. And so eventually, what happened is some of these religious leaders accused him of healing, because Jesus was known to be a healer, healing by the power of the devil. What is that? That's demonizing him. And that's how it goes, right? It starts with a disagreement, an honest disagreement. We see things differently. But then how it works in human behavior is we end up just snowballing that, and all of a sudden somebody's demonized. Somebody's not, we don't just disagree, that person's bad. That person's less than somehow. That person is delegitimized. And some of you have felt that, right? Some of you have felt that in your life. And then once you do that, it's a small step to harm that person. To harm that person physically, or to harm that person verbally or socially or relationally. It's the same cycle we see in monkeys, and it's the same thing we see in humans. Right? We just have less hair, but it looks a lot the same actually. We just have this process that we go through of disagreeing, but then demonizing, and then hurting and dispatching. I have a friend who's a leader of an atheist gathering in Phoenix. It's kind of like an atheist church. It's a community of people who want community, and they have common beliefs, but they believe things differently than what the typical church would believe. And a few months ago, he and I had lunch together. And I didn't talk about this publicly because it just never happened, but our lunch was about planning an event where he and I were going to have like this friendly debate. And we were going to invite One Church, we were going to invite the people he is a part of, and anybody else who wanted to come, and thought it might actually catch a lot of interest. And we're going to do press releases and all this kind of thing. And we were going to have this debate about the existence of God and whether or not religion does more harm than good. Sounds fun, right? And so we had this lunch, and we're talking, like, so what is it? How do you see these things? And I was talking, well, here's how I see these things. And the more we ate and shared, the more obvious it became, this is going to be the most boring debate of all time. Because the truth is, as I told him, I said, I hold my beliefs about metaphysical things very, very loosely. I believe in love, in goodness and beauty, in what's good and what's true and what's right. When it comes to all kinds of supernatural things and things that I can't explain and things that I haven't seen with my own eyes and things that can't be tested, I said I hold those things loosely. And believe me, there are some people in the Southeast Valley who don't like it that I hold those things loosely. I paid a price for that. And I have a great life, but that's just part of my experience. Some of you, same thing. And then he shared, sorry, I just adjusted my mic and it got louder, I think. He shared, well, you know what? This is amazing. Think about this. He's like, I think maybe at times I've been too hostile toward religion, and I've kind of written off too much, and I've probably gone too far at times. So you got this pastor of a church and this atheist gathering leader almost ready to hug, I love you, man, because we're finding that, we're not far enough apart to even have an interesting debate. It's going to be kind of, hey, I kind of appreciate you, man. I kind of appreciate you. Nobody wants to see that. And, that's not good TV in our culture. And so, I guess we'll just kind of hang out and stuff. But we're not, the event's just not going to work out. It's funny, I wrote this little illustration here this week. Later on that day, he texted me. We haven't talked in months. And so we're going to meet up again and it'll be a good discussion. But there's a price to pay for me and for him and for you when you hold things you're not certain of loosely. When you're willing to say in an environment where everybody else values certainty, when you're willing to say, I'm just not sure, there's a price to be paid for that, isn't there? Because there are other people who think you should be sure because they want to be sure. Now, they can't be, but they want to be, and they want you to be. And so there's a price to pay when you don't follow the rules. Now, I think, so happens that he and I are just being honest about who we are as human beings. And there's just a lot we don't know. And most people, I think, can see the goodness and the beauty in that, and the peace and the reconciliation, and all the great things that can come out of that. But there are lots of people who can't. And Jesus experienced that same thing, and we can identify with that. A lot of people live in fear, and they're afraid of uncertainty. Or they're afraid when they don't see clear boundary lines, or if they're not sure what you believe, and right? And so when you don't follow the rules, there's a price to pay, because there are people who are afraid, who will come up against you. And you might suffer a little bit for not following the rules. Second thing, there's a social price to pay for honesty. There were at least 2 religious leaders in the Gospels who should have been present. If the Sanhedrin met at night, exactly as it's reported here, they should have been present there. They should have been part of that. And their names were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. You probably recognize them if you've been around church for a while. Nicodemus comes to Jesus in John chapter 3, and he talks about what Jesus is doing. He's interested. He's sympathetic to Jesus. It's the passage where Jesus says, you must be born again. It's the passage where Jesus gives, the end zone verse, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. It's one of the most famous chapters in the Bible. That happens when Jesus and Nicodemus talk to one another. And then Joseph of Arimathea is the man who allows Jesus to be buried in his grave. When Jesus is buried after his crucifixion, it's in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And so these 2 people should have been present at the Sanhedrin that night. But there's no report of them speaking up. There's no report of them saying, you know what, I talked to him. Or I sympathize with his movement to the extent of if he's crucified, I'm going to give him my tomb. They didn't say anything. And so why didn't they? Well, we're not told, but we can probably make a safe assumption that they were motivated by fear. That they knew that if they spoke up and they were honest about what they believe and what they really think, there was going to be a price to pay. The nail that sticks up is the one who gets hit on the head. And they, out of their fear, they held back what they really believed. And this happened to Jesus without protest. Helen Susan was elected to be a member of the South African Parliament in the 1970s. And she was the only member of Parliament to visit Nelson Mandela in prison. Of course, this is when apartheid existed in South Africa, racial segregation in South Africa. She was the only person in Parliament. This lady, Helen Susan, was the only person in Parliament to criticize apartheid. She was immune from punishment because she was a member of Parliament. Criticizing apartheid could get you put in prison at that time, like Mandela. But she was the only person in leadership who had the guts to go ahead and speak out about what she really believed, and she visited Mandela several times. She continued to speak out even when she was terribly criticized, when she received death threats. You ever received death threats for saying what you believe? When she was receiving death threats, she still continued to speak out on behalf of goodness and racial reconciliation and equality in South Africa, and way before it was cool to do that. And another member of Parliament called her an embarrassment. He said to Helen Susan, because you're speaking out against apartheid, you're an embarrassment to the people of South Africa. Listen to this. You ready for this one? Listen to her comeback. She said, it's not my questions that embarrass South Africa, it's your answers. Mic drop. Drop the mic, walk away. That's all you have to do at that point. Helen Susan was willing to speak out at a time when nobody else was. She passed away a few years ago. But instead of being controlled by her fear, the fear of what would happen to her socially, she was willing to speak out about what she really believed. And now history rightly views her as a hero. By the way, we live in a society that values youthfulness in women. And you know what I mean by that, I'm sure. In Helen's life story, she was 45 or 50 when she found her voice. And she started speaking out against apartheid. She was a woman who found her power in her 40s and 50s and wasn't afraid to take on people who were threatening to kill her, and is judged as a hero because of it. Helen Susan was not afraid to speak out. Are you willing to speak up? Again, we're in Lent, season of preparation. These are hard questions, not fun questions. They're hard. Are you willing to speak up when there's a cost? Or do you remain quiet out of fear? Fear of what will happen to you socially if you speak up. A few months ago, I had the privilege of speaking at a conference in Minneapolis at a church called Solomon's Porch, led by Doug Padgett, who's been a guest here about a year ago. And we were talking about churches who kind of make the transition and make it known that they're going to welcome everybody in their church. And there were lots of churches there who had already made that decision. There were some pastors there who wanted to, but they knew a lot of people in their church wouldn't go along with it. And they were really, really dealing with fear. And so we had a great, constructive, encouraging conversation, just sitting in a circle. And Brian McLaren, if some of you know him, he's just a great author in our circles. And he was sitting there in that circle, and he said, you know what? He said, the truth is, when churches decide that they're going to welcome everybody, and they make that known, there are lots of people who leave for different reasons. There are theological differences, and that's okay. Everybody has a free will. We're all permitted to think for ourselves. He said some people leave not because they disagree. They leave because here's what's going to happen. They're going to stay in your church, and their friends and their family are going to find out about your church. And then they're going to have to go to Thanksgiving dinner, right? And then they're going to have to talk to their parents or their kids or their brothers and sisters or their coworkers or their friends or their past church friends. And they're going to have to explain to them, why is it that you're part of this thing? And that particular issue, that's like the litmus test for many people, on whether you're really a Christian or not. And he's like, it's not even that they disagree with you or that they don't love people. It's just they are afraid of the social alienation and all of the awkwardness they're going to have to go through because they say that out loud. You know what I mean? What a brilliant insight. It's so true. Social pressure can be so powerful that it can keep us from being who we really are and saying what we really mean. And this goes beyond theological or political stuff. You might be, I know many of you in your stories. I don't know every detail of your lives. You might be thinking right now, there are things about me I would love to share with other people, or I feel like I've been holding back for so long, or I feel like I put my dreams on the shelf to do other things. and I feel like I haven't been able to be fully me, and it just scares the heck out of me to say that to anybody. But I feel like I have to, but I can't, and I'm scared. Maybe that's you. Maybe you feel that way. Maybe you feel like you're holding back part of who you are. It could be all kinds of things. Or there's some dream you want to pursue, and you keep saying no. You know it's going to affect your family, or that somebody's not going to be supportive, or they're going to criticize you, and there's this fear keeping you from saying that out loud. You know the John Mayer song, Say What You Need to Say? Say what you need to say. Maybe that could become, I sounded exactly like John Mayer, didn't I, when I just said that? I know. Maybe that could just become a mantra for you. Say what you need to say. You can sing it better than me. Say what you need to say. Whatever's going on in your heart, whatever's bubbling up, whatever you kind of suppressed for a long time, whatever it is, say what you need to say. And don't be controlled by fear, the fear of social alienation or some social price to pay. I mean, guys, we've all done this. You can choose to live under the thumb of other people your entire life if you want to do that. Man, are you with me here? This is big time stuff that affects everybody's lives. You can choose to live like that, or you can choose to say, you know what? I want to love everybody. I don't have ill will. I don't want to just stir the pot or tip the apple cart for the sake of doing it. I just want to be me, and I want to be honest. And if you do that, other people, nice, thank you, and other people, one person is on board right now, me and you, sister. And I know it's everybody. We all struggle with this. And you can say, I just want to be honest and not live in fear of social alienation. That was the fear that we see in this passage. Lastly, the last fear is probably the worst. It's the hardest. It's also the one that disgusts us the most because it's the hardest. Because it's the one that we all would have the hardest time dealing with. And so when we see it in other people, it repulses us because we see that in ourselves and we don't like it. And the last fear has to do with the high priest. And it's an economic fear. It's a fear that has to do with your paycheck. And here's what that looked like. In the Gospels, we're told that during this Passover celebration, a massive annual feast in the Jewish tradition in Jerusalem, thousands upon thousands of people, religious pilgrims, descended upon Jerusalem, actually climbed to Jerusalem because it's on a mountain for this Passover. So thousands of people crammed into the city and the temple courts and going to worship. And we're told that there's this episode that a lot of people don't think fits into the life of Jesus, but it's something that all the gospel writers tell us. That Jesus saw what were called the money changers in the temple courts. And he was so disturbed and so angry by what he saw, we're going to break it down and talk about what was happening, that he picks up like a whip. Like there are animals involved in sacrifices, and you use whips to get animals to move in direct. He picks up like a whip. He starts swinging the thing. He takes tables where there's currency being traded here in the temple courts before people can go in and offer their sacrifices and worship. He takes the tables and he does this number. Throws them. He's swinging a whip. This is gentle Jesus, meek and mild, right? Hippie Jesus in Birkenstocks, hanging out in San Francisco. That's what a lot of people think of Jesus, but that's not necessarily the Jesus we encounter. He's swinging a whip. He's turning over tables. He's going down rows of tables and turning them over. This is a guy with a fire in his belly. This is a guy who believes something. You got to, if you're going to do stuff like this. And we read in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Now what's going on? Why does he do this? What we know is that during this annual Passover feast, this religious pilgrimage, there were a couple of things that were happening. Number one, everybody who came to worship was expected to pay what's called the temple tax. And the temple tax was an amount of money meant to support the temple and the temple system. This is also a theocracy. The government and the religion are intermixed. And so you had to bring a temple tax. Here's what was interesting about that. The everyday currency of the Roman world was the Roman denarii, and this is true where Jesus lived too. We have dollars, they had denarii. And so everyday commerce was done in denarii. You buy and sell in denarii. But the temple tax was a half shekel. It's a different kind of currency. So you can see where this is going. It's easy. So you bring your Roman denarii to the temple, but the temple doesn't take denarii. That's like unholy currency. They take shekels. So you have to exchange. You have to exchange your denarii for the temple tax currency, shekels. Now, you could, in any currency exchange, you can make a little interest. If you're a money changer, you can say, okay, I'm going to take your, denarii. I'm going to give you a shekel, and I'll charge maybe 1 or 2% for the privilege of exchanging this currency. We don't know exactly what was happening here. Perhaps this was kind of like the payday loan industry, and they're charging exorbitant. It could have been 20% interest. We don't know. They're charging exorbitant interest. So the money changer says, you give me your denarii, I'll give you the shekel, required to worship God. You can't worship without this shekel. So I'm going to give it to you at 25% interest. Pay up. Now, if you're a wealthy person, okay. Who does that hurt the most? The people who can afford it the least. It hurts the poor. So in order to worship God, they have to have a certain type of money. But they're getting taken advantage of in order to get that certain type of money. You follow this, right? Jesus is getting more and more worked up. The very people who are being shut out the most in society are now being shut out from God by the very people who are supposed to lead them to God. They're being fleeced by their priests. They're being taken advantage of by the very people who are supposed to be helping them. He's getting more and more worked up. Something else was happening. When you came to the temple, you were expected to offer a sacrifice. It was usually an animal. We think of that as primitive. I would say it is. And at the same time, when animals were killed, which were far less than they are in our culture, there was prayer. It was like a sacred thing to shed the blood of an animal. So we think of these people as primitive, but what if we visited an American slaughterhouse? Who's really primitive? Right? So animal sacrifice was practiced here, and you had a choice. You could bring your own animal. So let's say you're walking for days to get to the temple, and so you're bringing animals with you to sacrifice the whole time. You have to feed them. You're taking care of them. They can fall. They can get hurt. And of course, you have to sacrifice an unblemished animal because God deserves the best. And so it could be that you had an unblemished animal, but by the time you get him to the temple, it's a blemished animal. Or maybe you just couldn't afford an unblemished animal in the first place. And none of your animals are good enough for God. Hey, but wait, there's a way you can get an unblemished animal once you get to the temple, because their business is selling unblemished animals. And you can buy an unblemished animal at the temple, but it's going to cost you, of course, there's a convenience surcharge, maybe 5 times what the animal would have cost in the fair market. Hey, if you're rich, who does it hurt the most? The people who can afford it the least. So we've got this temple tax system that's taking advantage of the poor, and now we've got this animal sacrifice system that's taking advantage of the poor. Jesus doesn't criticize the temple tax. He doesn't criticize animal sacrifice. He criticizes the way that it's being used. The system has been created to take advantage of the poor, fleece them, get more money from them than what was fair, and hurt the very people they were supposed to help. And that leads to turning over tables and swinging whips. Who collects the rent money from the money changers and the animal sacrifice business merchants? The people in charge of the temple. They're the landlords. So if there were thousands of people here at this festival, and the tables are getting overturned, and the animals are being let loose, and whips are being swung, it's costing people money. Not only that, just quickly, once again, the Romans had occupied this place. A man named Pontius Pilatus is in charge of making sure there is peace and order in Jerusalem. The Caesar says, hey, Pontius Pilate, you've got a job. Here it is. Peace and order in Jerusalem, or you are dead. Peace and order. That's what the Romans valued. Peace and order. Peace meaning we'll kill you if you disturb the peace. Order. Pilate had no qualms about settling disruptions. Pilate crucified people right and left. It could have been thousands of people who were crucified under Pontius Pilate. Pilate had Roman centurions go in and run people through with swords while they were worshiping in sanctuaries. Pilate was a bloodthirsty guy. He was preserving his job. Would have had no problem quickly dispatching of Jesus for causing a disturbance like this. It's not over a theological thing. It's because he's disturbing the peace. Most historians and scholars, believers or not, see this as the final straw, the reason Jesus was crucified. Because he disturbed the peace. Out of his conviction, he said what he believed, in spite of the fear of being hurt, in spite of social alienation, in spite of financial recourse, in spite of physical harm. He did what he believed. He disturbed the peace at a time of great upheaval and a lot of thousands of people in the city anyway. Could have started a riot. Pilate says, "You're done. That's it." And of course, his followers watched all of this happen, felt powerless to do anything about it, felt powerless to make sense of it at all. This looks absurd. Why is this even happening? Hey, love and goodness and truth and beauty, and now it's getting just tortured to death unjustly. And they're trying to make sense of all this, and they're afraid. Now, all of us are tempted by fear, and all of us give into that fear in different ways. Some of us would like to believe that we always live an authentic life. We would like to believe that we always live an authentic life. You try, you do your best. It's a growth process. I think over time, we can become more authentic if we're intentional about doing that. If we're not intentional, then it just never happens, because it's just too easy to give in to fear. But there are some folks who can't admit that maybe they struggle with authenticity in those areas. And so oftentimes they just pretend they're authentic and they look down on other people for not being authentic. And then we get into this, hurting people if they're not following the rules, all this kind of stuff. So I wonder if we could admit this during Lent. As we wrap up here in the season of preparation for Easter, I wonder if we could admit, there are times when none of us is authentic. It's true of you, it's true of me. Areas of my life I've grown in a lot, other areas I have more growing to do. To be a fully integrated person, like integer, one in my own soul, my own mind. And how about you? Now here's some great news as we wrap up. It's good to end with good news, isn't it? Here's some, not just good news, great news. Peter denies Christ 3 times. He's just asked point blank, do you know Jesus? He's like, nope, 3 times. Just denies his leader 3 times. Leader who's poured into his life, just denies him 3 times, out of pure fear. Fear of physical harm. He knows what's going to happen to him if he says he's with Jesus, the same thing that's happening to Jesus, so he just denies him 3 times. Here's what the Gospel of John tells us after the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus meets with Simon Peter. Remember, Simon Peter denied Jesus 3 times. So the Gospel of John tells us that they sit down together. And Jesus looks him in the eye, and he says, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" Simon Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he says, "Feed my lambs." He doesn't stop there. He asks him a second time, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" "Lord, yes. You know that I love you." He says, "Feed my sheep. Take care of these people that I've been leading. Lead them. Step in and lead them." So he's asked twice now. That's not enough. A third time, Jesus says, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" Simon Peter realizes what's happening. It's a third time. How many times did he deny him? 3 times. How many times did Jesus ask him this question? 3 times. He says, "Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." It's kind of like this penance. He denied him 3 times, and Jesus gives him the opportunity to pay it back. "Hey, man, I forgive you. You denied me 3 times. You just said you're on Team Jesus 3 times. Now let's stand up, dust yourself off, and let's move on. And let's leave the past in the past and go get them. Attaboy." Isn't that great? Grace and forgiveness and the ability to leave the past there and move on. And so in our lives, as we struggle with authenticity, fear that may, keep you from speaking up because of fear of social alienation, keep you from doing what you know is right because of fear of being hurt, by the rule keepers. Economic fear that it might cost you something. There's also grace, that there's a new start possible. You don't have to live in the past. You can start now without the fear. So here are 3 questions. Do I follow the rules, even though I don't agree with them, because I fear what people will do to me? If you have, you don't have to keep doing that. Just like Simon Peter, there's a new start for you. Number 2, do I fear speaking up for what I believe because I fear my social circle will alienate me? Maybe you have, but you don't have to. Jesus says to Peter, feed my sheep. Let's move on. Let's go get him now. We can do this. Number 3, do I fear living an authentic life because of what it will cost me economically? In dollars and cents. Is there a price to be paid somehow? I don't know all the details of your story. If you've lived in fear somehow, you don't have to keep doing that. Jesus says there's a new start. The past can be in the past. We'll move on. So, how are we doing with these 3 questions? And your future doesn't have to look like your past.